Well, I think people will be hopping in. Why don't we get started with a little introduction? Hello, my name is Leslie Schultz, and I'm one of the three staff people at Love Living at Home. Glad to be here with you. Welcome, everybody. For those of you who are not members of Love Living at Home, we invite you to take a look at our website to find out more about membership with LLH, and about what we do. You can find the link to our website in the chat. Um, well, thank you, Don, for joining us today. We are looking forward to a presentation by Don Haas, who is the Director of Teaching Program at the Center for Climate Change Education at the Paleontological Research Institute, PRI, whose mission is to provide and support action-oriented climate change education everywhere, including with us. We're so grateful for the time you will be spending with us today, Don, and without further ado, I will turn the the Zoom time over to you.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to pull up my screen here. And we're going to start off with a question about this block of carbon. It is graphite. Graphite's pure carbon. I couldn't afford a big enough chunk of diamond to make the point I want to make. And I want you to take a guess if you think this is how I want you to think about how this compares to the amount of carbon in a gallon of gas. Is it a lot less, about the same, or a lot more? And I'm going to stop sharing for just a minute, except for I had the disappearing cursor, which is going to drive me crazy. And I'm going to have to escape to do that. There we go. Just by show of hands, you can just raise your hands and we'll look at that way. And let me know what you think the answer is. And I'm trying to see you all at the same time I'm looking. So you can either use the reactions button to raise your hand or just raise your hand. Is it a lot less? Is this block of carbon a lot less than the amount of carbon in a gallon of gas? Is it about, let me give you time to raise your hands. Is it about the same? Is it a lot more? Okay. And I'm going to leave you hanging on that and come back to it later. I think maybe Anne has seen me talk about this before. And now I've got you too big, so I'm going to shrink it down again. There we go. We'll come back to that in 10 or 15 minutes, probably. So our title for today is Exploring Our Grandchildren's Possible Futures Through Climate. And I added a subtitle of Moving from Climate Anxiety to Climate Action. And that's me. And another show of hands, which I'll just imagine what you're saying, I think, because of the cursor issue. Do you know someone born in about 2010? That's approximately a ninth grader, a 15-year-old. I'm going to envision that many of you raised your hands. And do you know someone born in the 2020s? That's a baby to a 5-year-old. The reason I raise that question is because most of us know and love someone who will be alive in 2100. And when we hear about climate projections for 2050 or 2100, that feels very far away. But it really isn't. A child born in 2010, again, that high school freshman or so, will turn 90 in 2100. We probably all know some 90-year-olds. And a child born today will turn 75. So this is within the span of the time of people that we know that we're talking about. And it's just not that far away. And this is a picture of my grandmother, Nellie Brown Loomis, who lived to be 97, and my daughter, who is named for her, who was born in 2004. So if my daughter, Nellie, lives as long as my grandmother, Nellie, my daughter will see the year 2100. So this is indeed very personal for me. And that's Velma that she's holding. And as I noted before we started, I'm going to depress you for the first part of the presentation, but it will get better as we go along. So again, we'll do a show of hands that I'll pretend I can see. Is there a climate emergency? So I see some hands going up there. Are you now, or have you ever been scared about climate change? And again, see some hands going up there. Should we be honest in our climate education and communication efforts? Yes. Okay. So let's take a look at some changes we've seen. Here is the USD plant hardiness zone from 2012. And this slide is a GIF that'll switch back and forth between what it looked like in 2012 and what it looked like in 2023. And if you can pick a spot on the map and watch it change between the two hardiness zone maps as the climate has already shifted. Here's another change, a little bit of a joke in there. This is from the summer of 2023 in New York City. Godzilla was added to the picture, but we had those orange skies. I telecommute to PRI from Buffalo, and we had hazy skies in June again this year. I don't think it was quite as bad in Ithaca as it was in Buffalo. And we've had a lot of air quality index days out of the good zone, not too much beyond moderate, but some. Last year, we set a record for confirmed tornadoes in New York State. I believe the record was 2020 was 32, which beat the old record of 25. But there might have, if there were any after September 12th, they weren't counted in this graphic. And looking at some of the reasons why we've seen these changes, I just was, this picture was just suggested to me yesterday, and I rather like it. So it's looking at Fifth Avenue in New York City in 1905 versus 1913. And in 1905, there's one horse, or I'm sorry, there's one car rather in 1905, and in 1913, in almost the same view, there is one horse and many cars. And I think there's good food for thought on that. And in 1913, coal was still the leading transportation fuel. It was used for trains and ships. So the biggest transportation fuel in 1913. And I am wondering, can we change our transportation system between 2025 and 2033? An 8-year difference like the difference in those two pictures of Fifth Avenue, as much as we did between 1905 and 1913. And I'm hopeful that we can. And a follow-up question is, do you think change is happening more slowly now? I personally don't think so. So I'm going to draw a lot from a talk I've given before, where we're going to talk about gasoline. And my goals for this chunk of the presentation is to astonish you, scare you, give you hope, and motivate you to act, and explain why I want to do those things. And we're going to take a look at a gallon of gas. And Americans burn about 376 million gallons of gasoline on the average day. That's the stat for, I believe, 2023. That's more than a gallon per person per day, and that should make you say, wow, that's a lot of gasoline. And I'm going to throw around some big numbers. So I'm going to sort of go off gasoline for a little bit and talk about scale. And here we've got a number line. If I was doing this in person, I would put up on the front wall of whatever room we were in a Post-it note with 0 in one corner of the front wall of the room, and a Post-it with 1 trillion on the other corner of the front wall of the room, and ask you to take a Post-it and put it where you think goes between 0 and 1 trillion. I think I do have it set up to do electronically, but I think for the sake of time, I'm just going to ask you to do that in your mind and picture where you're putting it. And so we'll skip past the virtual piece. So there's our 0 and 1 trillion again. So, maybe touch your screen where you think it goes. And the answer is that everything goes in the first 1/1000th of the length of that line. And most people get that wrong. And each one of the named numbers that we hear all the time, thousand, million, billion, trillion, each one of those numbers is 1,000 times larger than the one before it. I'm sitting in front of a computer that's worth about $1,000. If you picture 1,000 of those stacked up, that would be $1 million worth of computers. And there's probably $1 million house somewhere in Tompkins County that maybe you can picture. And if you had 1,000 of those, that'd be $1 billion worth of $1 million houses. And $1 billion is about the cost of the new Bills Stadium being built in Buffalo. If we had 1,000 of those Bills stadiums, that'd be $1 billion worth of, or $1 trillion worth of stadia. Let's look at what people generally, how they typically respond. That is a set of responses from doing an online presentation for Earth Day for college students a few years ago. And of course, there is only the one right answer. And those are very, very typical answers. I actually did this at a teacher workshop on Friday. And the answers look like that because the answers almost always look like that. I have never done it with a group of just mathematicians, though. So most of us don't have a good understanding of scale. And there are a bunch of reasons for that, but I think it's important to recognize that we don't have the evolutionary programming to understand that stuff because up until about the time I was born in 1963, almost nobody really needed to know the difference between 1,000, a million, a billion, and a trillion. And now I think everybody does because it's so important to so many things, finances, climate and energy, population issues. So we've got to work harder to help people understand scale. And a good way to do that is by talking about time. Everybody's familiar with a second. And if you have 1,000 seconds, that's about 17 minutes. 1,000 times 17 minutes is 1,000,000 seconds, and that's about 12 days. 1,000 times 12 days is 1,000,000,000 seconds, and that's about 32 years. And 1,000 times 32 years to take you to a trillion is about 32,000 years. So 1,000,000,000,000 seconds ago was before the dawn of agriculture and civilization as we generally think about that. And if we go to 10 trillion seconds, Homo sapiens have not been around quite that long. I think the best guess on how long ago humans emerged as a species is about 300,000 years ago. And 10 trillion seconds would take us back to 320,000 years ago. And these are examples of social math, and they're just a strategy for taking you, helping folks understand really hard to understand, either really big or really small numbers. And there's a citation for that. And I'm going to skip ahead and note that hopefully today's key ideas are true, important, and sticky. And I'll ask otherwise, what's the point? And I'll throw in just a bit of education ease. The anchor phenomenon for what we're talking about today is what happens to a gallon of gasoline after it's put in your gas tank, and some other stuff too. But that's a good start. And a couple of starting assumptions. Most Americans are concerned about climate change, and many, if not most, know it's real, it's us, it's a serious problem. We can do things to make it less bad. But very, very importantly, most Americans don't know that most Americans feel that way. And that's really quite important because it makes it easier to talk about if you realize that most of the folks are worried about it too. And that goes across party lines. And a related statistic is that 83% of New Yorkers want climate change taught in K-12 schools. And that's not happening at the way that it should right now. So that's the idea that people do care about this stuff, like I said, makes it easier to talk about it. And it's kind of like peer pressure. I'm going to go through this very quickly because I've got a lot to say. And another important assumption is that scientific accuracy and claims based solidly upon scientific evidence are essential but not sufficient to build durable understandings or to change the minds of those who dismiss the scientific consensus. I think that's very obvious in the world today. Just look at what people believe right now and what's happening in Washington and so forth. Good explanations are important, but not enough. Coherent storytelling helps, and hopefully I'm going to tell a coherent story about gasoline and some other stuff thrown in there too. I want to emphasize the most important thing that we can do about climate change right now is do something about it and talk about that something. For years, I said the most important thing we can do right now is talk about it. But over time, people are talking about it more. It is still just a minority of people who talk about it on any kind of regular basis, but it is more than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And I think we should talk more about fire and climate education efforts, as fire is at the root of modern climate change. And most people are familiar with fire, but not so much with greenhouse gases. And I'm going to fly through these. And note that I'm almost certainly trying to do too much in the allotted time, but I can share the resources so that you can dig further later. So as we've said, we burn 376 million gallons of gasoline on the average day, more than a gallon per person per day. And we want to think about where it goes. And again, if we were in person, I would pass around a gallon jug of water, about 3/4 full, as gasoline has a density about 3/4 that of water. And I don't want to pass around a gallon of gasoline very much, to give you a feel for what 6 pounds of gasoline feels like, what a gallon of gasoline is like. So, place it in your mind's eye, picture that, or your mind's hand, or whatever. That means if a gallon of gas weighs about 6 pounds and you use 10 gallons a week, that means 60 pounds of gasoline is disappearing from your gas tank. And we want to think about where it goes. We know from middle school science that matter can neither be created nor destroyed, only changed in form. And we need to know what gasoline is in order to figure out where it goes. And it's a complex mixture of hydrocarbons, which are chemical compounds made of hydrogen and carbon. And on average, its chemical formula is something like C8H18. The scientists in the room, the chemists in the room might recognize that as octane. And what do you get when you burn octane? Well, you get carbon dioxide and water, and that's from the combustion reaction, and you get energy, of course. And we're going to look at an animation of that combustion reaction. And you can see we've got the formula across the top, and I'll note that I cheated a little bit by having half an O2 so that the animation fits on the screen in a way you can see it better. We have 1 octane molecule, 12.5 O2, yields 8 carbon dioxide plus 9 water molecules. And we're going to highlight our oxygen molecules there, or diatoms, and our octane molecule, and we'll give it a spark, and things rearrange. So now we've got 8 carbon dioxide and 9 water molecules. There's our carbon dioxide molecules. There are our water molecules. And when we look at those 8 CO2 molecules, they weigh a bunch more than the octane molecule that we started with. That's not magic, it's chemistry. That's because oxygen was taken from the atmosphere to combine with the carbons in the gasoline. And you can look at the molecular weights if you want to. And so the resulting carbon dioxide and water weighs more than the gasoline we started with, because the reaction used oxygen from the air, not just the gasoline. So when you burn a 6-pound gallon of gasoline, you get 19 pounds of carbon dioxide. And we do that 370 some million times a day. That is probably a surprise to most of you, maybe not to all of you. But surprise is a strategy here. And surprise is fundamental to belief change. And I think we can and should engineer surprise as we try to help people understand things. And surprise generally indicates danger or opportunity, or both. And if we had more time, I'd ask you to share some things you learned by surprise, but you can just think about that. And more surprises will follow. And there's an interview with the author of this book to get an overview, and I can share the slides after. Now back to our regular programming. We get 19 pounds of CO2 from burning that gallon of gasoline. And it's pretty easy to picture a gallon of gasoline. It's not weird to think that it weighs about 6 pounds, but 19 pounds of an invisible gas is quite a bit harder to picture. So what we're going to do is recognize that an inflated balloon weighs a little bit more than an empty one, and fill up a balloon to gallon sized, and think about how many gallon-sized balloons would it take to hold 19 pounds of carbon dioxide. So again, we're going to do exercise in your mind's eye. Picture that you've got a balloon in your hand, hold it empty, think about how much it weighs, and fill it up to a gallon size, which I will do. That's about right. And so I'm holding it now and thinking about how much it weighs now. It almost feels lighter than the empty balloon because the density of the balloon air system or the balloon breath system is less dense than the balloon by itself. But of course, it does weigh just a tiny, tiny bit more. So it's also helpful to think about some other things that weigh about 19 pounds. Maybe I'll ask you to unmute yourself and shout out a suggestion or two here. What are some things that weigh about 19 pounds?
Bag of bird seed.
A bag of bird seed, a 20-pound bag of anything is very much in the ballpark. What else?
A 3-month-old child.
Yeah, so 3-month-old child, or depends on the child, maybe one a little older than that. But yeah, the larger of my 2 cats, the small cat was the one pictured with my daughter. That's Velma. Her sister Daphne weighs 19 pounds or so. It's a little bit bigger than the heaviest bowling ball. So thinking about how many balloons it would take to hold the equivalent of that. And again, you've got to subtract the weight of the balloon itself and just think about the stuff inside. How many balloons do you think it would take, gallon-sized balloons, do you think it would take to hold 19 pounds of carbon dioxide? Anybody want to shout out an answer? I'll spill the beans. It's about 1,100. So if there were 25 people here today, everybody would have to blow up 44 balloons to get us to that 1,100. And since we're not doing that, we'll animate it. There's 100 balloons. So we've got to do that 10 more times. There's 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 800, 900, 1,000, and 1,100. That's a lot of balloons from 1 gallon of gas. And again, if you want to get into the chemistry, you can figure out how many balloons worth of oxygen it took to do that. So burning that 6-pound gallon of gasoline yields 19 pounds of CO2. And that, again, should make you say, wow. And that's just a quarter of US emissions are from liquid transportation fuels, which is almost all gasoline, but there's also jet fuel and diesel in there. So if we look at that 376 million gallons of gasoline, that's over 7 billion pounds of CO2 every day just from burning gasoline. And again, that's just about a quarter of US emissions. And that should make you say, wow. And you should be scared and astonished. If we're honest about climate change, we're going to scare people. And being upset about climate change is both rational and necessary if we are to act. Why would we act if we weren't worried about it? There we go. So the first takeaway is that being scared and angry is a healthy response to the state of the world, and being scary can be appropriate too, but be smart and kind about it. Honesty is paramount. Scaring is a starting point, not an end point, and toss in some humor if you can. And you want to shoot for the right level of scared when you're talking to your friends and neighbors and or whoever you might be talking to with climate change, you want to shoot for the right level of scared and avoid hyper arousal, which is people are so freaked out and distressed they can't do anything. And hypoarousal is when they're depressed and lethargic and can't do anything. So you want to get into the window of tolerance where the body is in an optimal state and can get to work on the problem. And fear is our best hope. Some thoughts on emotions. We have a moral obligation to be honest. Honesty in this case evokes negative emotions. The best way to address anxiety generally, and including climate-based anxiety, is to address the source of the anxiety, to work on the problem, and ideally do that in community with others. And those last two bullets there, I think, are the most important of the hour. So keep those in mind, to get to work on the problem and to do it in community with others, and you'll feel better because you're making a difference. So get motivated by fear, but don't live in it. Get motivated by anger, but don't live in it. And it's also worth noting that virtually everyone understands at some level that learning about bad things in history and in the modern world is fundamental to a good education. And such teachings are also integral to most religious traditions. And I've given a talk on that you can link to the slides to from there. And I have been working on climate change to some degree for my entire professional career, which will hit 40 years in January. I started teaching in January of 1986. And I've been teaching about climate change at least a little bit from the very beginning, but more and more every year. And I know lots of climate scientists and climate change educators, and every one of those folks that I know either is scared or has been scared. They may have worked out a way to not be scared now. And they're doing this work in at least in part because they are or have been scared. And we should be scared, but not paralyzed by it. Fear, of course, can be good for you. It motivates you to do necessary things. If there's a baseball flying at your head at 90 miles an hour, you duck because you're scared. Avoiding or suppressing fear can be bad for you. We can probably all think of somebody who's suppressing negative emotions and it's not working for them. There's a nice research article that had a New York Times article to explain it to the layperson on how that's true, that lean into negative emotions. It's the healthy thing to do, from a couple of years ago. And back to our block of carbon. I will just get there for the sake of time. A gallon of gasoline is about 87% carbon by weight. So that means a 6-pound gallon of gasoline has about 5.5 pounds of carbon in it. So this is not enough. Do you think this is enough, having 2 blocks of carbon? That is not enough either. It is this much carbon in every gallon of gasoline we burn. This much carbon is coming out of your tailpipe. It, of course, doesn't look anything like this because it's in carbon dioxide, which is an invisible gas, and you can't see it or smell it or anything like that, but it's there. So I meant to order a 6 by 6 by 2 inch block, and I filled out the form wrong. And that's a mistake I'm very glad I made, because starting with a 6 by 6 by 2 inch block, people would just dismiss it because it's crazy talk. It also happens to be reality. But I'm very glad I ordered the wrong size block initially. My sister refers to that as fortuitous incompetence. So this is what 5.5 pounds of solid carbon looks like. So that is how much carbon is coming out of your tailpipe for every gallon of gasoline that you burn. And again, you should say, wow. So there we go. Now, the simplest thing to do, of course, is to not mess up the system in the first place. So don't burn the gasoline, don't burn other stuff. And as I said earlier, fire's at the root of modern climate change, and it's mostly fires burning under human control that I'm talking about. So we should figure out how to do less of that, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But of course, we've been putting carbon into the air increasingly ever since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution a couple of hundred years ago. And if we want to take carbon back out of the air, the simplest thing to do technologically is to grow plant matter. Just so happens that wood is about half carbon by weight. To make the math easy, we'll say that it's half carbon by weight. So that means 5.5 pounds is half of 11. So we need to grow 11 pounds of wood to sequester the carbon from each gallon of gasoline that we burn. And that should make you say, wow, again. It just so happens, and we can't allow that to burn or decay, or it'll put the carbon back into the atmosphere. And it just so happens that a standard 8-foot 2x4, probably the most commonly sold piece of lumber in the US, weighs about 11 pounds. So here is an 8-foot 2x4 that reads something like this 2x4 has about the same amount of carbon in it as a gallon of gas. So next time you fill your tank, watch the gallons tick by and think 2x4, 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 and figure out how not to burn so much gasoline. Okay, so there's me and my 2x4. That means we'd need to grow 376 million 2x4s a day. And that's 4 billion pounds of wood every day, or 1.5 trillion pounds a year. And we aren't doing anything remotely similar to that. I need to go back and run the numbers and make sure this is right. But I believe that for a single year's gasoline emissions, we would need to about double the amount of forest cover in the US. Okay, so takeaway number 2 is talk in ways that people can understand, use relatable examples. Everybody's familiar with fire. It's not at all true about carbon dioxide. Use social math, toss in some humor if you can along the way. And looking at another interesting thing on gasoline. This is gasoline use over time from January of 1945 to November of 2024 from the Energy Information Administration. And we'll pause for a minute and look at my watch and say, what time is it? Just tell me what you think is interesting in this graph, and maybe how it's relevant to different disciplines. And folks can unmute and comment if they would like. Anything interesting there?
I think in 2020, the consumption of gasoline was down because of COVID.
You are correct. Yes. The bottom of that trough right there is April of 2020. So everybody went home on March 13th, and everybody stayed home in the month of April. So gasoline consumption went way down. Other things folks note?
What happened in 1979?
Good question. That is actually, I think that's actually a little before 79, but that was the OPEC oil crisis in the late 70s. And also that inspired the shift to smaller cars, which took a little while to go into effect, and of course didn't particularly last. You can also see the 2008 economic downturn here. There's also seasonality to gasoline use. Goes up in the summer and down in the winter. But there's lots of places you can go with this graph. There is, and let me go back to that just for a second. You'll note we have not gotten back up to the peak use that we were before COVID, and I don't expect that we will, which we'll see that on a coming slide here in a minute.
Looking
So
back
there is,
at
yeah, pardon me.
looking back at 1945, back then, practically nobody had 2 cars per family.
Right,
I
absolutely.
only knew one family that had 2 cars. And
Yeah,
most women were not working outside the home, and
right,
not that I'm recommending that, but
right. Yeah, I hear you.
On the other hand, the cars were a lot less energy efficient.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and there's that graph is from the Energy Information Administration website, EIA.gov. And there are so many fascinating graphs that can be produced from the reams and reams of data that they have on that site. Really interesting things to explore there.
I think these suburbs were also
Yes,
only
yes,
starting to be developed. That's what I remember from my
that's
childhood.
right. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so some good news. Carbon emissions from electric power generation in the United States has fallen 40% since 2005. I find it fascinating that that's true, and I also find it fascinating that almost no one knows that. And I think it's really interesting to think about the reasons why. I think that's partly because good news isn't as engaging as bad news. And of course, it's been a gradual process. Um, how do you think we've dropped emissions by 40%? 40% in the last 20 years? Anybody? It's not just one reason. So anybody want to shout out what's amongst the reasons for that reduction?
Wind and solar?
Wind and solar is a big part of it. Um, Iowa got 60% of its electricity from wind in 2023, which is amazing. That's a gigantic change. There's another piece of it too that essentially the simplest explanation is we've replaced electricity from coal with electricity from other stuff. And all of the other stuff that we've replaced coal with is lower carbon. Most of it is natural gas, which per unit of energy has about half the emissions that coal does. But we've also added a lot of wind, and we are now adding a lot of solar. Solar hasn't grown as much as wind, but it's starting to. Also, 10% of the cars sold in the US and 18% of those sold globally in 2023 were EVs. And the global sales of combustion engine cars peaked in 2018. And I hope that's not a false peak. I have an EV in my garage behind me over there. But it's also important to recognize that while we need to make cars more efficient, we ultimately need to make a transportation system more efficient than cars. And we can talk about that again in a few minutes. So we need to temper good news with reality. So share that good news, but do so with caution, because good news can reduce motivation for action. I think the reasons for that are pretty obvious. If you think we're on to the fix, then you don't need to work as hard on the fix. And here's some more good news. This is CO2 emissions from combustion in advanced economies from 1973 to 2023. And we are back down to the level of, I believe, 1933 or so, which is amazing. Yeah, that's seven. We are back to the level of 73 for advanced economies. For the US, we're back to about 1933. And there's that slide. So there's where we were for coal in 2023, which is about the same as 1933, and it's continuing to go down. So in 2025, we're probably back to 1905 or so. So that's great news. But the global picture is not as cheery. But that is also changing. So there is reason to be hopeful about that. So the third thing is our third takeaway is to take action and talk about it in productive ways. So whatever you're doing now to help step it up and share it, remember that people do actually change their minds. That's a pet peeve of mine, is people claiming that folks don't change their minds. They do indeed change their minds. And I think the best example of that is gay marriage, where it was unimaginable 20 years ago that it would be legal. Gay marriage would be legal in every state. And the majority of people in both major political parties in the US think that's a good thing. But that's been the case for 10 years now or something like that. If you want to look at a good place for Reducing carbon footprints, drawdown.org is a wonderful site where actions are ranked by level of impact. So pick one and do it. Then talk about it in ways that both spread the word and the action and give you feedback on how big a difference it makes so that you can ramp it up as you learn. And now for some invigorating possibilities, we have to fire. And what I mean by that is, wherever we're burning something in our energy and transportation systems, we need to fire, get it out of there and replace it with something else. And here are a few examples. Solar cells replacing coal-fired power plants, EVs replacing internal combustion engines, and induction ranges replacing gas ranges. So those are all good, simple things on a personal level, and on a broader scale. So a little bit about the Cornell University Borehole Observatory, which is investigating how to heat the Cornell campus without fire. So right now, Cornell's the Kubo is part of Cornell's Deep Geothermal Research Project. And currently the Ithaca campus, 40% of the emissions from the Ithaca campus come from heating buildings. And the Deep Geothermal Project drilled this 2-mile deep hole on the edge of campus in the summer of 2022, I believe, to investigate whether we could get heat from deep below the Earth's surface to heat the campus. Currently, the campus is heated by the combined heat and power natural gas plant on campus, and that's hooked into the radiators across campus, and hot water is generated along with electricity, and that hot water is pumped through campus to heat the I believe it's 1.6 million square feet of buildings on campus. And the hope is that we can replace the natural gas plant with pairs of wells that cold water is pumped down one well and water flows underground to the other well way deep in the earth, where it's about 90 degrees Celsius or 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and heats up the water, and then they bring it up through the other hole and heat the campus without burning anything, and run the pumps that power the system using solar and wind. And there's my cursor again. I hate it when the cursor disappears. Okay, so there's information on the Deep Geothermal website, and favorite attributes of stuff I've talked about so far is the undeniability of what we've been talking about. You can't deny that a gallon of gas weighs about 6 pounds and has 5.5 pounds of carbon in it. You can't deny that we burn 376 million gallons of gas a day. And I can't see the third point because my cursor disappeared and you're on top of it. I'm going to escape for a minute. Move you down and go back to that, maybe. Come on. You can see what's going on now. It's just not cooperating. There we go. Okay, so. You can't deny that most Americans don't have an intuitive sense of scale. And I should also give a shout out to John Allen Powless's book for the idea of the timeline activity. His book, Innumeracy, I think was published in the 1980s. And you also can't credibly deny that being scared or angry is motivating in the proper context. So of course, some people will deny it anyway. So be it. We can get past that, I think. And the big takeaway is that it's urgent. Let's get busy. And I think, what time is it? I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions. There's lots more stuff I can share from different resources that are right here on my computer. So questions, comments? Yes, Anne.
Hi, Don. I don't want to get political here because it's awful, but are there, well, I know, but yeah, are there things that unfortunately that the current administration is doing that are, I mean, they're undoing a lot of very good things. Is
Yes,
there
they-
something in related to climate change where they're doing some things that will take a long time to recover from, or is that not quite gotten?
Yeah.
Well, that's a great and complex question. They are doing horrible things. We are, fighting to keep grant funding on climate change education going. They have already killed a lot of that, and since the so-called Big Beautiful Bill has passed today, I think that zeroed out climate change education grant funding from both NOAA and NSF, which is, in my opinion, a tragedy. But good things will continue to happen in spite of what they're trying to do. And I think the best example of that is around coal. They're trying to bring back coal, but coal is not going to come back. It just isn't. As I said, the state of Iowa got 60% of its electricity from wind in 2023. That's generating money for farmers who are, leasing their land to have windmills on there. And it's less expensive than coal. And solar is now less expensive than coal as well. So just because somebody in Washington says to burn coal, people aren't going to go back to coal. It's simply not going to happen. And people often raise the point that India and China are still burning a lot of coal. That is true, but they're burning. They have slowed their rate of growth of coal, and in fact, China last year, for the first time, saw both economic growth and growth of energy production with a slight reduction in carbon emissions. So China is very much in the renewable energy game, even though they still have an awful lot of coal-fired power plants. I don't believe they're building any new coal-fired power plants either. That is new. I mean, they were doing that up until a year or two ago, but I don't believe they're building anything new these days on that front. And it's an important issue too, is that we've had good infrastructure for a very long time in the United States, and folks in other parts of the world have not, and they deserve to have energy in their homes as well. But everywhere in the world, it is now, I believe, everywhere in the world, it's now cheaper to use solar and wind for your electricity than to use fossil fuels, especially if you can produce it on site, because transmission requires building transmission lines and stuff like that, which costs a lot of money. So if you can just put solar cells on the roof of your house, then you've got your electricity production right there. And it can be grid tied, of course, and things like that. But if we can support folks getting out of poverty and getting energy in a cleaner way than we have done, then that's great. Other questions? Comments? Smart remarks? If not, I'll show you another pretty cool website where you can explore some of these things. Share button.
There's at least one question that was put in the chat.
Okay, I missed that.
I didn't do it. I just saw it pop up.
Okay, let me take a look. Just get this website up. So it's eia.gov/state. And I thought I was sharing my screen and I'm not. There we are. So let me get to the chat. Where did the chat go? So is the impact of fire produced by the US military included in the statistics and graphs? Yes, if it's in the US, it is, yes. And the US military, if it were a country, would be at least at one point, I don't know if this is still true, but at one point, the US military, if it was its own country, would be the largest emitter in the world. I think that's probably not true anymore, but they're still certainly very big. And I think it's not true because they've actually been working to reduce emissions for a long time, in part because when you've got a convoy to take stuff across wherever you're having a war, the biggest things in terms of weight for a convoy is fuel. So if you don't need to bring fuel, your convoy gets a lot smaller pretty quickly, and that is easier to protect and so forth. So that's one of the reasons. And of course, all the Navy bases in the world are at sea level. The U.S. military has a fairly long history of being concerned about climate change at the same time that they're causing it, which is true of all of us, but the military to a greater degree. So this site is a really fascinating site. It has an interactive map of essentially all of the energy infrastructure in the US. It also has really nice overviews of energy summaries by state. And I'll put that link in the chat for you too. So this will take you straight to the New York page. If you chop off the stuff after the last slash, that'll bring you to the national map. And so you can see that New York was the third largest producer of hydropower in the nation after Washington and California. That's because of Niagara Falls, which is the largest hydropower plant east of the Mississippi and the largest power plant in New York State. And we are the lowest per capita. We're 50th of 51 for total energy consumption per capita. And that's largely because of New York City and the dense population there that uses mass transit. And a question that I like to ask is to have folks take a guess at the to rank the largest energy sources for either total consumption or for electricity. And folks routinely get that wrong, which is worth thinking about, and kind of fun to push buttons a little bit and raise the issue that if you don't know where your energy is coming from, you should learn that before you fight hard on where it should come from. So in New York, the largest source of energy by far is natural gas, and it's so large because it's used for both electricity production and for heating homes and buildings. And the next thing is gasoline, so at about half as much, a little less than half as much. If we look at just electricity, natural gas is by far the largest portion of it. And you'll note there is no coal here. We closed our last coal-fired power plant in 2022, I believe. And then there is this awesome map where you can explore the energy infrastructure and see what's near you. You can turn off different layers, and I'm going to turn off all the power plants and then bring some, oops, I want to turn off all the other stuff more than the power plants. So let's turn that off. Turn that off. There we go. And now bring the power plants back. And you can explore around. You can see there's a huge number of solar farms in upstate New York, and you can click on any one of those and get some basic information about it. So I happened to click on something in Moravia, and it's a solar farm with 3.6 megawatt installed capacity. And you can go down to the combined heat and power plant at Cornell. You see that's a 30-some megawatt plant. And you can go over to Niagara Falls and I'm clicked on this is a solid waste power plant powered by burning garbage. But down the river a little bit is the Robert Moses power plant, which is 2,400 megawatts or 2.5 gigawatts. And again, that's the largest power plant in New York State. And you can pull up the data for any one of those power plants and see its generating history, which is, I think, really pretty cool. And I will also pull up the EPA Power Profiler, which is oops, why did it do that? And I think these are government sites, but I think they're going to last because they're about energy rather than about climate. But you can't talk about energy without talking about climate. And you can, this is an interactive map of the grid subregions from across the country. New York, upstate New York has the cleanest grid in the country because we get a good chunk from nuclear, and by clean, I mean lowest carbon. We get about a third from hydro and about a third from nuclear and about 6% from wind and a little bit, and 2% now from solar. And then 25% from natural gas. And if we go back, we can then look at emissions and sort them. And you can see we are by far the cleanest grid in the country. That's by luck of where we live, but I think it's interesting. And I didn't talk a huge amount about how the weather is changing, but the weather is changing. We can see that this week, and we can see that in the fires that have come down from Canada and so forth. And I'm glad to take more questions or comments. Or
what is your best guess about the nuclear power plant that's being explored by Governor Hochul? What sorts of things do they look at when they try to pick a site? And just any comments on that?
Yeah, that's again a great and a complex question, and it's new. Last week I think that news came out, so I have not read up on it as much as I would like, but certainly generally for thermal power plants, which are power plants that generate electricity by boiling water and turning turbines, which includes nuclear power and fossil fuels. It's got to be near a source of water for cooling. So that's a key characteristic. Beyond that, I'm not sure what goes into the decision making. I know that here in Western New York, where I am, the legislator from I don't remember if he's a senator or an assemblyman, but from a little bit south of Buffalo, is pressuring the governor to consider, I think it's the Huntley plant that's in Fredonia, whatever the power plant is that's in Fredonia, that was a coal-fired power plant and has been now shut down for a number of years. He is advocating for that site. And, I would, off the top of my head, I would say that if you're going to build a nuclear power plant, doing it where there's a coal-fired power plant makes sense because there's the infrastructure for the tying it to the grid and shipping that electricity out. But it's not a question I've had a chance to think very much about since this is brand new. So
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question about in this big, beautiful bitch of a bill. I mean, at some point in the next couple of years, we wanted to put solar panels on our roof. And it sounds like the energy credits to do that are going away.
I believe that's I believe that's what they're trying to do. And I will also note that the A version passed the House, then the Senate changed it, and now it goes back to the House again. So there's still a possibility that it won't pass because it's got to, the House has to approve all the changes the Senate made. So it's not too late to call your representative and raise holy hell about it. But yeah, I believe the solar credits are intended to go away. And the good news is that the price of solar has been dropping, but probably not enough to make it accessible to the common folks without the incentives. But the price has come down. So I don't, again, the big beautiful bill is not big and not beautiful. It's big, but it's new, and I have not. I know some about it, but I don't know enough about it to speak intelligently about all that's in there.
Well, the email I got from either the New York Times or the Washington Post, I don't remember which, said there were 300 different things to look at in it.
Yeah,
So I didn't look at them all either.
right. Yeah. Yeah, it's head spinning intentionally how fast they're changing things. Any other questions? We are a little beyond 3, so. And I will put my email address in the chat if you want the slides or anything like that. Let me know, and I can share them with the Love Living at Home folks if you would like it.
Yes, is the chat recorded? Because I've been on Zooms where the chat was not recorded.
I thought it was automatically recorded. I think you can. I don't know.
And
Yeah,
do you
there's a
mind
save
if I?
chat option. If you click on the 3 dots up at the top of the chat window, there's a
Oh.
save chat option.
Really?
Yep.
Let's see. Oh, 3 dots. Save
Yep.
chat.
It says Tuesday talk at 2, and then next to that are 3 dots, and those click
Yeah,
on them.
I did it.
There you go.
Now I was planning to forward this to